I think an obvious sort of moment that we're in that has essentially become probably 3 years worth of change is just clients going through constant restructuring, reorgs, reorientation, I guess, which is a reflection of them adapting to the times that we're in. And I think that one of the themes or things that kind of come through to us then as agencies is the fact that our clients are constantly adapting to new groups of stakeholders. And I think that that is an amazing opportunity actually for us to be great partners.
So welcome Catherine and welcome everybody to another episode of the Good Sides podcast where we explore some of our takes on the industry, talk about some of our work and just really sort of lift the lid a little bit on what we do here.
Great to be here.
One of the things I'm really looking forward to with these conversations is just the chance for us to bounce some ideas around, because when you get lost in the day-to-day, it's quite easy to just get caught up in the doing and not the thinking about it. So it's really nice to have this time together.
Absolutely, good to zoom out and think about the bigger picture.
Today we're going to be talking about adaptation, about operating in a changing environment, a changing world, which I guess is a kind of truism all the time, change is the only constant, but really what it means to sort of show up in an adaptive way within the kind of the world that we operate in.
Great.
Maybe we could start by just talking a bit about some of the issues that clients have around change and navigating change. I'd love to know a bit about your experience and things that kind of pop up time and again in your practice.
I think an obvious sort of moment that we're in that felt like it was perhaps a moment in time but has essentially become probably 3 years worth of change is just clients going through constant restructuring, reorgs, reorientation, I guess, which is a reflection of them adapting to the times that we're in. And I think that one of the themes or things that kind of come through to us then as agencies is the fact that our clients are constantly adapting to new groups of stakeholders. And new groups of people to partner with, build relationships with, create change with. And I think that that is an amazing opportunity actually for us to be great partners. But I do think that it adds an extra layer of complexity perhaps to the work that we're trying to do, because priorities are changing, teams are changing, relationships are often in a state of being formed quite regularly, maybe every sort of 6-8 months, every year, depending on the organisation.
Yeah, I think it's so true, and it makes me think about a couple of things. One is, the need to be empathetic and to try and be that real kind of partner, and I think we try really hard to play that role, to be able to really kind of listen to our clients and help to support them in navigating those kind of internal kind of structures. And I guess the other thing is to remember always that a client's kind of workload will be much broader than kind of our workload working with them. That actually they're juggling many contracts, many kind of relationships, many projects, and we're one kind of item. And then when you think about the stakeholders, we're one tiny kind of speck on their kind of to-do list.
Absolutely. I think when you're in the middle of a project, it's quite easy for it to become your world, and you have to remember the world that they're operating in as well. And I think actually it's a great opportunity for us to bring insight into the mix, because stories and humans and insight are kind of, I guess, campfire moments for teams to get around. And so I think if we're doing our job well, the insights that we uncover, the strategies that we create are opportunities to bring those groups together. And I think one of the things that I've been really struck by since joining the Good Side is just seeing how from sort of day one, maybe even day zero in any kind of project process, that we are very much working as one team. And I know people talk about that a lot, and it's quite typical to say, oh, we want to work as an extension of the client team. But seeing how, stakeholder interviews are a non-negotiable at the start of any kind of strategic project, seeing that there is digital workspaces that we create where the client's getting a live feed of what we're finding and we're iterating with them. I think that that's so powerful because it puts our clients in a place of having real oversight of what we're doing, but also it gives us the knowledge of their stakeholders from day one, so we can really adapt the work we're producing and think about the people that it's going to at the end, and sort of almost like the campaign that needs to be built and designed to help them be successful.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and it makes me think about, I guess, as you touched on the end there, the end of the process, which is actually, about helping Insight to have a seat at the table. That often I think Insight teams within organizations are kind of fighting for not just budget, but for kind of share of voice internally. Actually when you get into these big strategic decisions about product launches or about kind of campaigns, there are many kind of stakeholders, and there is a bit of a kind of strategic bun fight often going on, and that actually for Insight to show up in that space, it takes a level of kind of confidence and rigor and strategic clarity, and I think we're really kind of acute to the fact that that's an important part of what we're providing for clients.
Definitely, and I think what I also think is a great sign of when you know that you're in one of those projects where you are designing for change at the end is that you might not, you've got your digital workspace, you've got a broad sense of where you're going to go with the project, but I think it's more typical now with briefs that we see that clients may not quite know what is needed at the end because they might be dealing with an ever-changing situation. And so, being able to have strong views but lightly held about what is the right output going to be to hit particular audiences, having enough time built into the process to really produce different pieces of work that are more tailored to those stakeholder needs throughout the process feels more important. And I would go so far as to say, like, if we were looking over a project approach with a briefing call at the start, an interim, and then a final debrief, like that kind of project nowadays might be a bit doomed to fail because it shows that you're just not close enough to the business that you're working with, and you're not working really as an extension of their team.
Yeah, we talk a lot about kind of adaptability and sort of nimbleness here, and embracing a flexible mindset has been one of our values, I guess, since day one. And partly that's about helping the team to be comfortable with change and to be able to kind of embrace change in a kind of like curious and kind of positive way, which we'll talk about in another episode, I think. But I do think there's something in there which is about recognizing, as you say, that client needs and internal needs are shifting all the time, and actually part of being a partner is about being able to kind of go on that journey.
Yeah. I think it's also the fun bit. I think it's where you get invention. I think it's where you create different types of creative outputs or strategy outputs that you maybe have not done before. And I think it's where innovation happens. So I think as an agency researcher or as a consultant, that's the best bit of the job. I don't think anyone really wants to be churning out the same project every week for a different brand. I don't think that's why anyone got into what we do.
Yeah, I agree. What else is going on for clients then, thinking about this kind of world of change and the kind of flux of culture as much as the flux of their kind of businesses?
I think there's a big kind of pressure, particularly with Insight teams, to be on top of technology. And of course, AI is part of that, but I think there's been such an advancement in research tech, types of self-service offers, that clients can lead themselves. Obviously, in many cases, we're seeing shrinking budgets. So I think there's an enormous amount of pressure on client teams to not only manage partners, manage stakeholders, but also a pressure to feel as though they need to keep at the edge of tech developments, and they should be doing more in-house, and that they should be making more of the data that they have. But we know, customer data lives in all different departments. It's not a single source of truth. And so I think it's just a lot of competing interests for clients and a lot more hats to wear, probably.
And what does that mean for us? I mean, I guess in a way, that sense of kind of shrinking budgets and this kind of sense that there's probably technology out there that can do a lot of things. I think that clients get internal kind of pressure around being an expectation to deliver a bunch of stuff through tech without any kind of understanding of what is viable and what's not. But then I guess when it comes to us as a business, and I think, as you say, budget shrinking, lots of kind of tech pressures, it feels like the way that we're often responding to that, I think there's probably three responses. One is trying to do these nimbly to try and make things kind of work more efficiently, which I think is always a pressure. I think the second one is doing things that technology emphatically can't do. So doing kind of really kind of close consumer work, real deep dives. I think making strategic hypotheses and linkages is just something that tech is not necessarily great at. Doing kind of the less obvious kind of forms of kind of strategic analysis. And I think the third one is there's always going to be a role to knit everything together. I think clients rarely have even if they'd love to, I think they rarely have the bandwidth to be able to go, okay, well, I'm going to take all these things, I'm going to take my AI solutions, I'm going to take whatever the quant self-serve is, I'm going to take the ethnography that I've done with the good side, and I'm going to take this kind of semiotic piece and I'm going to bring it all together. I think that's something that they just really don't have the capacity to do often, even if they would love that to be their role. And so I think our role often can be being the kind of architect of this mixed method approach, and also kind of holding the insight that comes from that kind of sense of holistic analysis.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And I think our role as dot connectors and synthesizers is really important. And I think, it also means that we can help them make the most of what they've got, but also then, I guess, take on a role as I said before, with a bit more of a campaign mindset, to be a partner in thinking about, okay, well, so what? How do we show the business that there's this opportunity here, or how do we show the business not to do something, which is often the way as well. So I think there's an opportunity for us to be dot connectors and to kind of root some of their data in wider culture and other things we're seeing. We obviously speak with experts a lot to kind of validate perspectives and look also ahead to see what's coming, because obviously a lot of the data they have is what's happening now, what has happened, rather than maybe where we might go in the future. And I also agree, I think, in terms of sort of where we can add most value, I think, looking at a brief this week, which is a client coming to us and saying, I absolutely don't want a generic audience report. I don't want a trends report. I can buy that, or I've got loads of those. I've got these coming out of my ears that tell me generally, what youth want here or what this audience wants here. I want something surprising. I want something different, refreshing, that the brand, my competitor isn't looking at right now. And I think that we have the opportunity to be a bit more maverick, probably, and help clients be a bit more maverick when they are sitting on, data that perhaps gives, a robust read, but a broad read.
Yeah, completely agree. What about, let's think about another strand to this whole kind of world of kind of change and flux then. Can I come away from clients and thinking more about kind of audiences and issues? Because I think that it's fair to say, if you think about the way that the media landscape has changed over the past, 20 years, that actually audiences, the way the audiences are kind of comprised, the way they're found, the way they kind of show up has changed massively. And I think the communications industry is sort of constantly sort of reckoning with that sense of change. But I think there's a really clear implication for us in terms of how we think about finding and understanding audiences, what audiences are and how that's kind of shifting, as well as just thinking about how issues and ideas move through the culture.
Yeah, the power balance is very different, isn't it? And I think in terms of sort of talking to audiences and finding people and finding those sort of, I guess, like protagonists that brands need to speak with, I think there's more of a reason to think of sort of recruiting participants, if you like, as casting. So yes, obviously there's times to speak to Gen Pop and there's times to test and to look at clients' key audiences, but I think there's also a need to really make sure that we're speaking to the people that are creating culture and are leading culture, and I think that's something we love doing here. We're not scared of a brief where we have to go out and sort of find people that you won't find on any research panels, perhaps in the industry, and find ways to leverage the more edge or the niche stories, and to connect with communities that perhaps brands aren't thinking about.
Yeah, and I think that obviously the way that kind of content and culture is created has changed so much, through, I guess, this whole kind of era of social media, that I've heard a lot of kind of chat recently about whether that era is over, but we've lived this era of UGC and the changing notion of kind of where stories and culture sort of stop and start, which I think has been really fascinating, and probably for better or for worse has really changed the culture and society kind of wholesale. But I think we've really embraced that sense that you can connect with kind of cultural initiators, let's call them, at all sorts of levels, that actually this kind of, I guess, this kind of older model whereby you talk to some kind of rarefied people in some sort of niche kind of cutting edge communities in metropolises is perhaps not really like the way that things are being constructed and consumed now. That actually, if you want to understand, whether it's something to do with food or whether it's something to do with fashion, that actually there are those trends and those ideologies are shifting at all sorts of levels, and you can kind of interface with them at all sorts of levels too.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there was an era of sort of like sanitized sort of like, do you remember we used to talk about prosumers? That was a real term, like kind of going to look for the people that, as you say, kind of more urban, living certain types of lives. And I think that now I see success more, particularly in sort of deep audience pieces of thinking more like a journalist, like going to uncover the story, maybe the untold stories within countries, within communities, within a particular category, and finding ways to bring those stories to brands, because ultimately they need ways to differentiate, and a lot of brands in the same space are probably consuming a lot of the same insight and same content. So I think there's a need to do something different to help them get a competitive edge.
Agree. So we think about this idea of change and just kind of the theme of this podcast, which is really about kind of flux and how you kind of understand that. But what do you think it looks like in terms of, I guess, the sort of values and the kind of mindset that we need to have to be kind of operating in this kind of slipstream of change?
I think we need to be in a much more experimental mindset. And what I mean by that is not necessarily, long-term bets, but I think that, when it comes to, as I said before, like running projects and thinking about, okay, I'm starting here where I'm ending, being comfortable with the fact that, for example, to get to the answer that's going to serve, a complex stakeholder mix, that we might need to pilot different types of outputs or approaches to see what sticks, because change is quite constant, and we need to kind of go with, we need to meet people where they are. So I think being very fixed is obviously the absolute no, but I think this idea of kind of low risk pilots is helpful. So that could be adding in a bonus deliverable that's quite easy for the client to say yes to, which we can try without lots of risk. It's about sort of thinking about maybe adding a slightly more out there spec to the wider audience spec to see if we capture different insight, and also experimenting within how we're capturing stories from people in terms of our methodologies. So I think having a kind of experimental pilot mindset is really important, because I think that just reflects the reality of where we are. Technology is moving so fast, clients are under so much pressure, and trying to bring the project processes or the methodologies of the past into this arena just isn't going to work. And an interesting example of that, I guess, recently, not so recently, but it feels recent, is COVID. So there were a lot of agencies, probably qualitative agencies before COVID, that maybe hadn't dabbled in digital research and maybe looked down on it, honestly, because didn't feel that there was the depth there. And whether you liked it or not, you had to pivot. And we saw many agencies really embracing talking to consumers and humans in very different ways. And let's be honest, they're not different, they're just how we've been talking to each other in any other space apart from research. And there's been some byproducts of that have been interesting, which I'm sure we can talk about. But I think one of the real positives of that has been that we were able to meet people where they are. And it was a global pandemic that really forced some of that change in the industry. It would be great if we could create our own sort of experiments, burning platforms, and sort of experiment before we're forced to. And I think we all feel probably that with the speed at which Gen AI is moving, we're going to be forced to. So we better start piloting now.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think that what's happened, is that the pendulum really swung, right? So everything kind of went very kind of digital, very remote. We were always very hybrid at the Good Side anyway, so we always were kind of knitting things together, and I think that's a very core part of how we work, is being able to pull from a whole different range of tools and recognise where there's a role for digital and where there's a role for sort of physical. And so for us it was quite an easy switch in a way to just sort of like turn off the physical tap and just really kind of maximise the digital. And I think we were already quite good at it. But what I see now, and I hear it from clients and from other people in the industry, is that there are lots of agencies and clients who have got so comfortable with remote that actually they don't really think about anything else. And I totally understand why it kind of works from a cost perspective, it works from a practicality perspective. If you don't have to keep moving around to go and see people, you can do things, online, and lots of people doing, really focusing on kind of Zoom groups. We know other agencies that are fully remote, and we meet people in the recruitment process who don't want to go anywhere or even come here. And we've really kind of been quite kind of I guess, quite sort of like strong in saying that's not kind of who we are. You know, every Monday everyone's here, and there's something really magical about knowing everyone's going to be here and being able to catch up and eat together and spend time together as well as work together. I think really kind of is a really core part of kind of what makes us who we are. But I think, you know, we do loads of face-to-face research now, and I think lots of people just aren't really doing that. And I guess part of that is a client expectation, and part of it is individuals and agencies within the sector who've just got so used to not moving around. Maybe I'm a traditionalist in some sense, but I do think from an ethnographic sort of insight, kind of cultural perspective, yes, so much of culture is happening online, but it's happening because it's referencing the real world, it's referencing real life. And I think that having one-to-one conversations with people in real time in their own space is infinitely different to having a conversation with someone on Zoom. So I'm very much kind of the mind that we have to be approaching this from a hybrid perspective in order to get the best.
I totally agree, and I think there's a real difference between, as we know as researchers, like what somebody tells you in the first hour of a conversation versus the reality when you visit them at home and see how they're living. You know, like as humans, we filter, and I think that you need both to be able to sort of understand almost who people would like to be and who they maybe say they are, and actually the reality of who they are and how they're living. And I don't think there's any replacement for that. And I think arguably in a world where clients have got more and more data at their fingertips, you know, they are able to tap into research tech to do quick tactical pieces. We don't need to be producing more of that. I mean, I don't think it would be necessarily our aspiration to, but I don't think we need to be adding to that mountain of facts and data points. I think our job is to kind of help them go where the action is and to really kind of contextualise the behaviour shifts that they're seeing, and I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, I agree, and I think if I think about some of the big kind of pieces of work we've done over the past few years, you know, think again coming back to this idea of change and thinking about kind of cultural change and ideological change. We've done a lot of work and we'll continue to do a lot of work around how cultural concepts are shifting. And I think often we've done some really interesting pieces. I think the November masculinity piece has been really interesting, and we've talked about it a lot and had the privilege of being able to share it a lot, which is kind of great. But really that piece of work was about understanding how notions of masculinity are subtly shifting and how the online world is a kind of key part of that, and the voices within that space and the narratives and the symbols in that space. But we had to look at it holistically and for quite a long time in order to really try and get our heads around grappling around this kind of complex issue. And it did involve, you know, knitting together a raft of different methodologies and being able to look at it, have the kind of like the privilege of time really to look at it, which was a real, you know, luxury. I'm very lucky to be able to do it, and I know that's not always going to be the case with every brief, but I guess there's a hope that we can always bring a little bit of that into any kind of complex cultural brief.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think even if it's as simple as taking something that we've learnt digitally and then kind of embedding it in cultural analysis and a wider perspective, or bringing in experts to give a more kind of future-facing view, I think that the textures that go around that digital work is really important. I think also it's interesting to think about the time we're in just from a kind of human perspective and ways of working, of, you know, the recent resurgence of people going back to the office, and, you know, a lot of our clients being told that they need to be back in, you know, 3 or 4 days a week perhaps. And it will be interesting to see, I guess, what we all learn from that and what we kind of realise we've been missing and what we're yearning for and things that we don't want to go back to. So it'll be interesting to see if that sort of phenomenon affects the way in which, not obviously just the way we work together within our teams and our businesses, but also, I guess, the way we do research. I'm interested to see if that makes any shifts.
Yeah, really interesting. And I wonder whether if people have to go to the office for 4 days a week, they'll start to think, I'd rather be on fieldwork. And that might start to really kind of like reinvigorate the offline stuff. But I guess something I was thinking about when you were talking was, it's a bit like what we've tried to do in the office around making time in the office feel more meaningful, therefore it feel valuable. So it's not just like a kind of like mandatory thing because we're old, but it's actually more about, it's a really valuable thing for all of us to be together. And I think there's a sense that you can bring that same mindset into the research, which is, if we're going to do face-to-face, how do we make it feel really valuable? How do we make it feel like a really kind of important, kind of meaningful interaction and a meaningful experience for the clients too? So almost kind of like making it one part of a bigger piece, but making sure that it feels kind of really weighted within that mix.
Definitely. I think we have to, if we're taking the time to go and meet people in the field, if clients are making the time and the budget for that, you have to make sure that it's going to be a really brilliant conversation, and that can only happen if we put a lot of thought into casting people, but also really treating them with respect as participants, being very conscious of how we're telling their story. The worst thing we could do is to sort of try and take the Zoom discussion guide into the field. That makes no sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other flip of it is that when we're doing digital methods is to try and understand where the limitations sit. So, we know that often those interactions are a bit more surface level, they're a bit more kind of impulsive. So how do we either kind of run with that and recognize that's kind of what we're going to get, or find ways to disrupt that kind of thought process? So often when I'm thinking about research design for a digital piece or a piece that's hybrid, I'm thinking about how I can disrupt people's tendency to not really engage. So how can I actually make them engage or make them kind of reflect in a way that I would do in an ethnographic one-to-one, and try and either use an online medium to do that or use a number of different intervention points to try and make them kind of get deeper into an issue or deeper into themselves. And I think that's understanding how you can sort of work with the limitations or try and disrupt them is, I think, kind of key to making that paradigm work.
Definitely, and I think as it relates to adaptability, I think the digital space is an amazing opportunity to adapt with the participant. So like if you're kind of hanging out with them essentially for a couple of weeks or months, you get the opportunity to kind of get them doing tasks and bringing perhaps people from their friendship groups or their families or their communities into the conversation. Like there's a lot of depth that you can get to, but as you say, you need to really think quite carefully about where are the moments of disruption and how can you get not just sort of the surface level of what they're telling you in an IDI, but really get them to become ethnographers essentially. That's always a fantastic way of using those digital spaces to really empower them as participants to be part of the team, as well as reflecting on their own behaviour.
Yeah, I agree. And we were talking, James and I, in a previous episode, we were talking about experience and, the notion of experience and how important it is that everyone within a research encounter, has a positive experience. And I was doing some workshops actually the other day in person in the US, and afterwards I heard a couple of the participants saying to each other, "Oh, it was really fun. I really enjoyed that." And that, for me, that's like the ultimate win, is that they kind of go away. Obviously, I want to go away with insight. I want the client to go away happy, but I want them to go away and be like, "Well, that was actually, I didn't just get paid some money, but actually it was a kind of interesting moment in my day," because it means they were engaged and that they felt like it was an exchange rather than a sort of slightly rudimentary extraction, which I think is the sort of danger of doing any kind of research, really.
Yeah, I totally agree.
You touched on, I think, AI in a previous part of this conversation, but and within the landscape that we operate in, within the LinkedIn stream that we kind of find ourselves in, for the whole of the communications and sort of media and brand sector, as well as research as part of that, AI is a huge kind of conversation. There's a huge amount of anxiety around it. There's a huge amount of expectation around it. There's a huge amount about anger and interest. There's so many emotions that are wrapped up in this kind of moment of kind of, I guess, technological step change. But I thought we should touch on it as a kind of topic in itself.
Yeah, totally. I've also been reflecting, obviously we're post-Cannes now, so there's been a lot of talk about AI in relation to advertising, and I think it's interesting. I was thinking the other day, I don't know if any other industries are having quite the introspection moment that kind of media and advertising comms are having. And I do think that's part of the fact that as an industry, we've always been at the cutting edge of where culture's heading and of where technology is going. And so it almost feels like we've kind of got the pains of thinking about this probably when other industries haven't even got there yet. And we know that there is an operational load to what we do, right? There's a huge amount of project management that goes into what we do. A huge amount of science in screeners and getting back analysis and putting that into grids and thematizing and all of the good stuff that we need to do. And some of it is absolutely valuable to the process and to meaning and understanding the story and really sort of uncovering the truths. And some of it, probably, if we could expedite it, we could spend more time on what I was talking about earlier and thinking about who are the stakeholders in this project, what am I finding out, what does this mean to them, how do they like things delivered, what will convince them, oh, that person's more of a Word doc person, that person needs a film, that person needs a data point and a business case. So I think that, there's lots of anxiety around it, understandably. I don't think there's ever been a bigger shift probably in our lifetime. But I think that there's ways of us in that sort of pilot mindset of sort of really trying to help us hone our craft rather than seeing it as taking away our craft. But obviously, I think the real reckoning comes with, like, can we protect our craft and make the case for the fact that, you know, our craft is going to lead to better commercial results than, I don't know, creating a AI-generated ad, for example.
Yeah, I think for me, there's sort of two things. One thing, touching on what you talked about, is about it being an opportunity to kind of to have a bit of reckoning on, you know, where we do add value and really kind of getting sharp on that and on where real value lies in what we do. We've got a really clear point of view on that, and I think the people we work with know that is definitely a really strong part of our proposition, around strategic recommendations, around inference, around sort of curating data and, you know, generating a holistic point of view on it. But I think the other thing is that I'm kind of interested in, which I think people talk about a bit less within our sector, is around the kind of creative idea sort of generation that you can get from the inferences that AI might make that might be wrong, and from thinking about the way that, you know, all those kind of hallucinations in the machine and the sort of like jumps to conclusions that actually might feel like bum steers, but actually might just be quite interesting to explore. And I don't know, I feel like there's a whole playful side of it that, because people are worried about maintaining control of creativity, and I kind of understand that, I think a lot of people are not willing to really kind of like play around with the kind of messy ideas that come out of the other end. And I do think there's probably some sort of magic to be had from the kind of like, always from the mistakes. There's always like magic in failure, and I think there's like something about learning from the sort of fails within AI that's quite interesting.
Totally, and I think it feeds back into that sort of pilot mindset of like, try a few things and be prepared to fail, versus saying we're putting all of our chips, you know, on redeveloping this whole part of our process, and that's what, you know, I think you need to definitely be playing around with it. And I think it's really interesting, actually, particularly for independents and smaller businesses, that, you know, it could allow you to take your ideas and stretch them to executions that you just wouldn't have been able to create before. So it's actually quite an interesting way of stress testing, I don't know, an insight or a creative brief. Like, does this work? Let's put it through some AI generation and see kind of what does this look like in the real world. I think that's quite exciting. And I think that whilst we need to sort of look at the kind of efficiency side, I think we shouldn't just sort of be looking for a race to sanitizing everything. Because we should be looking more at the opportunity to create change as well. So I totally agree with you.
I think certainly from the client's point of view, and just for the industry at large, around this kind of sense that we might be approaching a race to the bottom in certain spaces. And I think we've seen it in the tech innovation within the sector over the past, 10, 15 years. So we talked about communities at one point, but I think social listening had this moment where, it was the kind of new thing and it was going to replace everything. And then it almost became a bit of a race to the bottom around people competing on the same kind of product. I think that will happen in AI analysis too. There'll be a load of investment, there'll be a few players, the market will shake itself out, and there'll be a few people who sort of survive, and they'll just relentlessly compete on price point or kind of tiny features, which is kind of fine. And I think we're never going to be in that space, but that's also okay, because that's not a place that, as a business, it's not interesting for us to be there.
No, I agree. And I think that it's also interesting to see, like, there's a client at the end of these experimentations. So I think as agencies, we can get quite hung up on, like, what should our product be, and let's create an AI product. And I've seen a lot of, like, really interesting stuff kind of launching. But I'm curious to see what the reply is from the client. Like, okay, there's this AI product that's been created, it promises to solve these problems. Does it? Where are you using this in your mix? And I think that we don't know yet. I think we've got lots of clients that are at the cutting edge and experimenting, but I'm really keen to hear more from clients on where they feel it's adding value, and to learn from that. Because there's a danger that I think we get into really deep introspection as agencies, as an industry, and we sort of forget what matters, which is clients, and are they seeing it as a value-adding part of the mix?
I think you're completely right. And I also think that as an agency, our perspective is always going to be on understanding that kind of mix and the mix of tools that are available to us. And that's really certainly the way that we're approaching AI and generally right now, much as we have approached things like social listening and communities and other digital methods, like where do these tools fit into our toolkit, and how do we, as kind of people who look at things holistically and who approach sort of change from a point of curiosity, how do we work out which tools help to serve our needs better and help us to kind of get where we're going better, rather than think about kind of one solution that's going to kind of change everything. So it's interesting in this conversation. I feel like we've started from a place of a kind of sense of the business needs around understanding change and adapting in order to survive, which is sort of like the theme coming into this. And I feel like where we've kind of ended up is in a place whereby what we're most excited about is really the opportunities within change, you know, to remain curious, to remain experimental, to remain innovative, and to really kind of approach this with a spirit of kind of optimism and creativity.
Definitely. I think it's a time to experiment and to pilot and to get even closer to clients, really, to make sure that we're adding value, because there's lots of different ways now that we can add value, and we should see that as an exciting opportunity.
Thanks so much. Really interesting.
Thank you.